Army transformation is not just about new technologies. It requires aligning requirements, resources, contracting, and acquisition to maintain rapid and relevant capability deployments. As part of this comprehensive strategy, the Army aims to achieve outcome-driven contracting through flexible, iterative, and performance-based models, such as continuous competition across a portfolio ecosystem and as-a-service approaches for use and consumption. The Army's next-generation command and control effort exemplifies these processes, contracting goals, and how the Army will continue to engage industry to improve outcomes and to create a stronger, more capable force. To moderate this panel, we're joined by Lieutenant General Dave Bassett, United States Army retired. General Bassett is a senior counselor with the Cohen Group in Washington, D.C. He also serves on a number of corporate and nonprofit boards, both as a director and senior advisor. He served over 35 years in the U.S. Army, with more than 20 years as a member of the Army Acquisition Corps, serving as a program executive officer for more than 7 years, and successfully managing and delivering systems and programs across the Army's combat vehicles and network portfolios. He retired in 2024 as the director of the Defense Contract Management Agency. Dave, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks. For all of you who've hung in for the very last panel, thank you. Thanks. Congratulations. You stuck around for the very best panel. And I know they didn't want to, I'm just telling you, you look down this panel and you realize they saved the best for last. I'd also like to say that, General Lowry started out the day as the best looking general officer, and then he fell flat on his face with all of his jokes. He's not the funniest general officer. That would still be me. So good luck, Doug. I can see he's going to rely on his looks. That's all fine. We got a fantastic panel with us today with 2 members from industry and 3 within the government that cover the range of Army Futures Command, our contracting professionals, and our requirements professionals in the cross-functional team. It really is a bunch of rock stars we have here on the panel. I'll give them just a moment to introduce themselves. I will say that it's great to be on a panel with people that I've known and trust for many years. Joe Welch and I worked together as a command team in PEOC 3T. Danielle supporting from the contracting center, and I've never met anyone on the panel before. Sorry, Mike. We haven't. It's just the way it is. So I'll let each of our team members introduce themselves. First, you, Joe.
Okay, thanks. I'm Joe Welch. I'm the Deputy to the Commanding General for Army Futures Command.
Colonel Kaloostian.
I am Colonel Michael Kaloostian. I am the Director of the Command and Control cross-functional team. For the last 2 years, I've been at Army Futures Command headquarters, co-leading the next generation C2 experimentation effort.
So Danielle is on her second panel of the day. You guys heard how smart she is earlier. And she doesn't like it when I say nice things about her, but I will say that of all of our contracting center directors, she is, I think, easily the most aggressive and forward-looking and trying to do things differently. And she's been doing that long before frankly, long before this administration, and she's been pushing the envelope for a really long time. And so when you push the envelope in the contracting community, I always got irritated that people would say, well, you're going to go to jail if you break that rule, right? Everybody talks about going to jail. And the reality is people don't go to jail for bending the rules on contracting or pushing the limits. They go to jail for putting money in their own pocket. And so you are not going to jail, Danielle. I know that. However, if you did go to jail, I have no doubt that you would establish dominance quickly. It's a fact. She wanted me to make fun of her. I worked on that all day. I'll even skip over her. We know she runs the contracting center at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Over to you, John.
Well, I'm John Parks. I'm the founder and CEO of Parry Labs. We're an AI infrastructure company for edge platforms, tanks, planes, ships, satellites, etc. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, JD. And lastly, Tara.
Tara Murphy-Doherty. I'm CEO of Govini. We're a defense acquisition software company.
Did I tell you we had a killer panel here? Rock stars. All right, we're going to start today with Mr. Welch. Joe, we've heard it emphasized at AFC that transformation isn't just about new technology, but rather really a full scope of reform across requirements, resourcing, acquisition, contracting. What is AFC really doing, do you think, at this point to implement that reform across that whole continuum?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And you and I have talked a lot about this, right? Like what's involved in acquisition, and I think obviously acquisition reform, a hot topic, seems perennially a hot topic, but a lot of drive behind it right now. And I think there's this tendency to like jump to program management offices, right? Programs of record, and believe that that's what acquisition is all about, and to fail to realize that. There's a lot of elements of it, from the requirements that the military departments are coming up with, the means that we use to contract for it, which is the theme of today, the developmental efforts that may set in motion, what future capability is going to look like, the way that we sustain capability, the way that we align our resources, and how we budget and how we react to change, like that's all part of acquisition. And it's just funny to watch people that think that those people are acquisition, that's what they do, that's what's either right or wrong with the system, and kind of not realize that it's that broader piece, right? So I think just the recognition that like that concept of big A acquisition is really what we need to look at if we're dissatisfied with the outcomes is like really important. I know we're going to talk a lot about contracting here today, so I'll talk on maybe a couple of the other ones on that General Bassett mentioned on requirements and on resourcing, right? So requirements, right? The Army has been really transforming the way that we approach what it is that we even want in the first place, right? So I'll start with our chief, with General George, what he's been doing with transformation and contact, which kind of when you think about it is just there's technology that's out there in a very fast-moving area, and our focus areas, to date, have been in UAS, counter UAS, electronic warfare, all areas where tech is really outpacing, the systems that we have designed to, to acquire, procure, develop, test, et cetera. And the concept of TIC is very simple, right? Get some of that capability, get it in a soldier's hands within a formation at a rotation, understands its strengths and weaknesses, right? And use that as our basis for understanding the capabilities that we really need, right? So from the Futures Command perspective, we've been supportive of that through directed requirements, which are just a recognition that something exists and probably has relevance to solving, one or more of our challenges. And all we really need to do is get into soldiers' hands to better understand it, right? Like that's a fundamentally different way of approaching what it is that we want from a requirements perspective. The other one I would say is we've worked within Army Futures Command under General Rainey, the characteristics of need, which is a title that we've given something that we didn't want to call anything that existed already, because the system will just start treating it like JSIDs or, this very formulaic process. We really just wanted to get in the space of describing to industry the problems that we're facing in large, complex scenarios. So we brought up Next Gen C2 already. That was the first one that we did, a large complex scenario if there ever was one, and described the characteristics of our problem space to open up what the solutions could be, instead of saying very prescriptive components of what we were looking for. We left it pretty wide open. Autonomy, I think, is ripe for this, right? Instead of the Army saying, this is the kind of robot I need, this is how large it needs to be, how fast it needs to move, the battery consumption, et cetera. Why aren't we instead saying, we need to be able to conduct breach operations in a way that's much more safe for our soldiers, right? We need to be able to leverage robotics and autonomy to do that. Opens up solutions a lot more. So that's really what we're doing from a requirements perspective. I guess the last thing I'd say on that is, it's less a relay race, like with a handoff from the requirements guys to the acquisition guys, and then we move on to the next thing. It really has to be iterative. Just briefly on resourcing. So like we have a 2-year budgeting process right now. Like, so the Army, when the services decide what they're going to budget for, they're doing that 2 years in advance, because we have to submit that up to OSD, needs to go through that process over to OMB, White House on the Hill, right? And then it, then we get the money two years later, right? And just think about how crazy that is, right? The war in Ukraine started in 2022, right? Ukraine had somewhere on the order of 3,000 drones that year that they manufactured, right? The next year was hundreds of thousands. In 2024, right, it was 1 million, and this year they're on track for 5 million. And so, the fallacy in thinking that we can exactly plan out how we're going to spend money 2 years from now, let alone year or 3. Like, that's not a failure in our ability to adequately plan as much as it is a constraint on, getting our soldiers and formations the things that they need. So what the chief and the secretary have been doing on flexible funding, I think you're going to see more of that. And that's going to enable our folks who are, kind of our decision makers below our chief and secretary in these capability portfolios, the ability to move very quickly with new technology and things like that. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm sure the rest of the panel will address the contracting elements of the question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. One of the things you highlighted, which I think is important, is that when you talk about approaching requirements the way they talked about it, testing can conceivably change as well. And I think it's a shift that talks about understanding capabilities and limitations rather than testing against a specific set of well-defined criteria. Are you adjusting the way you're approaching testing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first of all, I think we have outstanding test professionals in the Army Test Evaluation Command. And it's exactly as you said, having those folks along with us throughout really highlights, the kind of the good things about what we're seeing and the bad things. And that really shouldn't be a pass fail, especially if that capability gives soldiers and formations something that's better than what they have today. Would it meet all of the elements of a traditional requirement document? Maybe or maybe not. But that's not necessarily the risk decision that I think our leaders need to be making. And I think ATEC's been outstanding partners in that with us.
Yeah, I'm very encouraged to hear that outlook. Let's move over to the perspective from an industry perspective. On one hand, we're telling industry that the Army wants to be agile and change what it wants. And on the other hand, we're asking them to invest well in advance for significant industrial capacity. And those two things are sometimes at odds. Over to you, Tara. I know you have to deal with our contracting system. You're on the receiving end a lot of these solicitations. If you could just name kind of one outdated procurement approach or norm that you think we really have to challenge if we want to get better at matching the pace of modern conflict, what would you change?
No, Dave, I don't think I could name just one.
So could you name 4? We'll just do 4 norms that you would challenge.
Yeah. Well, I will. And I'll also mention what I think is working and underscore what Joe talked about as well in terms of there's a lot of change that's underway to help in this regard. All of the initiatives that we've seen over the past 6 months around moving toward firm fixed price contracts, especially for technology purchases, that's something we've been talking about collectively for a decade. And we see, I think, the Army really at the forefront of moving out and starting to shift its way of thinking. Even just a year ago, that's not where the Army was. So it's great to see momentum in that regard. Also, executive orders on defense acquisition reform, executive orders on the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. This is really exciting to industry. To those of us who navigate procurement from this side of the world, I don't think, when has the White House ever talked about contracting and procurement? It's been quite a while, if ever. And just enforcing the legislation, the statutes that are on the books will go a long way. The other thing that I think is actually very much working, and yet is a little bit of a redheaded stepchild right now, is the FAR. So everyone hates the FAR except for me and maybe Danielle. And the reason I love the FAR is because despite the way that it is treated, it is not actually the Baltimore Catechism. It is a choose your own adventure book. And what people think is that the FAR tells you what cannot be done and what rules will be broken and send you to jail. And in my experience, the FAR actually takes a disposition of, if it's silent on the matter, find a great KO and they'll run with it to make it happen. And chances are, just keep turning the pages, because there's a way to actually legally get done within the federal acquisition regulations what you're trying to achieve. So much of what we need to do to work together between DoD and industry already exists. We just need better partnerships between industry and contracting in order to make it happen. I think that strong relationship is one of the biggest successes of Next Gen C2. I don't think it's ever talked about, but that has contributed significantly to the progress that we've been able to make collectively, especially in terms of new innovative contracting mechanisms that help drive the mission. That being said, there is a ton of change that still needs to occur. And I don't know that there are so many things I would clamor for that are new, haven't been already raised today, or are unknown, except for maybe one, which is speed. So one of the unique aspects of working with the defense tech companies, who are relatively new entrants to this space, is we have a tremendous amount of pressure on us to deliver quarterly returns. I know you think, I see the eyes rolling. I understand what publicly traded companies do. They have very serious obligations to shareholders to do the same thing. But they're on the rails, by and large. They know what's happening. This is the goal. They are predictable. When you are venture capital backed, you are in growth mode, you are scaling, predictability is the goal, but it is not yet attained. And I can't tell you how many times we have conversations with contracting officials who say to us, we'll get it done April 1st. It's no different than March 31. No, it is very different. So being more transparent about timelines, having a business mindset to understand things like quarters matter to us, just being able to plan better helps our companies be predictable. And it doesn't put the government in a position of having to do anyone any favors. We're not asking to change operations. We're just asking for better communication and transparency. So that's one thing I would urge.
I appreciate that for sure. I have the opportunity in my consulting work to work with sort of large public and private companies. And my sense right now is that although there's a lot of change, there's also a lot of unpredictability. And so particularly you're seeing folks say, we want to have the flexibility to buy something different and change what we buy so often. And at least from where I sit, I think that stands at odds with the idea of ramping up predictable production. So we have this idea of demand signals. Do you think you're getting the right demand signals that help you plan from a corporate perspective?
I think things like characteristics of needs statements start to get there. But no, we don't see a consistent demand signal. It's very much tied to how integrated in the community are you to have one-to-one conversations or conversations with that mission owner and understand what's coming around the corner. But I'll tell you, our software is used at scale across DoD in the acquisition and sustainment communities. And probably 90% of the problems that we solve for those organizations are getting a better picture of demand, because forecasting is hard to do, and supply in terms of availability. And then there's, of course, trying to be proactive about addressing industrial base challenges and shortages to meet that demand. But I raise that example because it definitely impacts more than the tech community.
I think just one thing I'd react to what Tara's saying is, as the government, we could probably do a better job in terms of consolidation of demand. That's across the board. I know we're talking, software company, but things like batteries, right? I mean, we buy a lot of them. We don't consolidate our demand. So predictability, like we might be able to get some gains if we can consolidate what that demand signal looks like. We've seen that in certain areas. I think we've got work to do, but that's another probably way that we can help.
So this kind of takes me, when we think about the predictability of demand signals, and at least for a lot of companies, that represents opportunities to compete, or where they have on-ramps or windows of opportunity for industry. What I found in the past is there are times when, as the Army goes quickly, industry doesn't perceive there to be a lot of competitive opportunities, because once a capability has been demonstrated in a unit, there's this perception that is now the selected item, and that unit demonstrations constitute a competitive process. Over to you, Danielle. How do you see these windows of opportunity for industry, and how are you making sure that industry sees a level playing field that they feel comfortable investing in anticipation of Army demand?
So I think it's kind of multiple things, and I think I can tie what both Mr. Welch and Tara said in this answer. I think one of the things that I've seen in talking to a lot of companies is companies, for the most part, for the Army, have always watched ASALT. They've always watched ASALT and the money that comes to ASALT for when things become a program of record, because that's when things, that's where the money is. And going back to kind of the panel we had before this, thinking about us not thinking of long-term sustainment or very early on research and development, we're now looking at a kind of like an approach of the total thing we're buying. So tying those two things together, if you are interested in a capability or your company does a specific type of capability, watch early on in what's coming out of what currently under AFC, right? Watch what that's coming, because I will tell you from a contracting perspective, I am going to, and this ties to what Tara was saying about contract types, I'm going to have a conversation with Colonel Kaloostian and say, okay, what is your next steps for that? So you plan for, you're going to try something out, you're working with PEO C3N. If this winds up being a good idea and turns into a program of record, what can we leverage that was done early upfront and all the money that was spent from you that could then be leveraged in the PEO? Oh, by the way, if that is a widget, how does that then translate to AMC? One of the things contractually, regardless of how the Army is set up, we can look at what the thing is we're buying early on from research and development to where it is in sustainment. And I'll use some examples. So when in my last job, I worked for CCOM, and I will tell you before I went to work for CCOM, I was the division chief for contracting over CCOM. And I remember all the time just being absolutely angry that no one thought of sustainment up front in those contracts, right? And then when I came back here to get this job, I reorged ACCAPG to put the sustainment, the research development, and the program of record people together to think about the long term from the very beginning to the very end of a contract. Talking, Mr. Welch talking about resources. So resource to us means color of money. Color of money matters because color of money goes on whether it's research and development, whether it's a program of record, whether it's AMC, right? We think R&D money, we think OPA, we think OMA. Well, how can you structure a contract type to do all of that? If I start out, for example, with a BAA, I've now completely restricted you. If I start out with a CSO, I've now completely restricted you. If I start out with an open solicitation, which allows me to use a combination of this and FAR type contracts, right? I have now not restricted you. So, and it kind of goes back to what John was saying on the last panel. We have what's called shaping briefs now. So at the very beginning of a requirement, people come in and, we can use NGC2 as an example, right? In the very beginning, we talk through what should long-term this look like? How should we do it? We pulled in all the players to do that. I think looking at models like that and how, John talked about, he does the same thing in his portfolios with the vehicles. That is crucial. So one of the things I think, and back to the actual question you asked me, don't look for.
You're actually going to answer my question?
Yes. Don't.
That'll
so
be
I
a
think
refreshing change.
I don't think a lot of times people look for industry days, call for topics or call for solutions under a specific customer. Try and follow the product, right? Try and follow the product line from the very beginning, because I think what's super important is tracking that. So if we issue a call for solutions under AFC, follow that product line, because the earlier on we can tell you what we're doing and where we're going, the more you can invest as soon as possible. Did I answer that?
Maybe. You might have.
Okay.
I will say though, as you walked and talked us through the trade-offs in terms of contract vehicles and how it limits you and understanding that relationship between the type of resources and the type of solicitation that you're using, I think that just reinforces for me the importance of having people in our business with deep understanding of these so that they understand those trade-offs. That kind of nuance. The nuanced understanding of how those things relate shows why that experience is important, right? And I think, I'll just say every organization that I ever ran, our vision statement started out the same way. It started out, and Joe's probably going to laugh because he probably still remembers it. It starts out as a team of trusted professionals. And this idea that the acquisition world requires people that are professionals, that have years of experience and understand those nuances. Those aren't things that you learn in your first 2 or 3 years. I mean, you've got to get to the Botox phase before you understand. You said it earlier. I'm just following up. By the way, she demanded that I give her a hard time today. I wouldn't normally have done this. Okay. No one believes me. But I think it does show that deep understanding and why that is so important. How are you bringing your workforce along with that level of understanding?
So one, it's in their performance objectives that they have to think, strategically about things. So, and now thinking about different examples, and just because I think it's important for you all to understand, it kind of goes back to what Tara was talking about. The FAR is not the enemy. So I think right now in industry and in acquisition, we have, I think what people think is a FAR contract and an OTA, and that's all you hear. And when you hear FAR, you hear formal source selection. So everyone thinks that means FAR Part 15, and people think OTAs. There is so much more than just that. I will tell you, so Mr. Welch and I actually, when we first started working together was 12 years ago. And we were doing the jitters programs when it came back to the Army as tactical radios. And I remember during the time, this is probably one of the first times that we wound up breaking glass. At the time, there was the Better Buying Power. Do you guys remember the Better Buying Power initiatives where it said basically contracts couldn't be more than 3 years and you basically had to recompete every contract? And I was like, oh, okay, we're buying radios that are going to be fielded for 20 years. That's awesome. I'm going to be in sole source hell for the rest of my life. We're going to write this contract. It's going to be 10 years. We're going to include escrow accounts in it, long-term warranties. We're going to think through what's going to happen if the soldier breaks the antenna off, throws it, all the things we could think of. What we also thought through was how complicated of the radio was we were buying. And we thought out to do a 2-step sealed bid. A 2-step sealed bid can completely be done in 45 days. 45 days. You could get $1 billion contract done in 45 days. Step 1, give me it. We're going to do what's called like a bailment agreement. By the way, have all of you heard of a bailment agreement? Probably not. Super cool. You got something. We want to test it out. Here's a bailment agreement. We go try it out. Next step is how much does it cost? Oh, yep. You win. We bought it. Move out. 45 days. Funny thing, the FAR actually says currently today that FAR Part 14, which is sealed bidding, is the preferred method. It is the preferred method of contracting. Has any of you done a sealed bid? Right. So again, lots of tools in your toolkit. So if you get your contracting people involved very early on, we can think through of using a FAR Part 12 or FAR Part 15 or a FAR Part 8 or a FAR Part 12 or an OT or a combination of all the above to get you what you need.
So there's no silver bullet.
There's no silver bullet, but it depends, right? And it goes back to what we said on the earlier panel with Lauren, right? Who's the industry involved? What are you buying, right? Are there non-traditionals? Is CAS a player in there? Is it not? Can we break up the contract into small enough increments, right? There's so much to be had. If the majority of our time was spent on thinking through, going back to what I said in the last question, if we spent majority of our time thinking through the Army has this need. How do we get after this need? Who is the industry involved in developing the capabilities for this need? And if it works, how do we get this to go long term? How do we incentivize industry? How do we keep competition? The other thing that we didn't talk about this earlier, but that Army open solicitation we talk about, one of the other things that I will now publicly say about the Army's open solicitation is we have created this world in Army contracting where you all watch time periods and ceilings on contracts. You think, okay, I lost this 5-year contract. I lost this 10-year contract. It's not going to come back out until year 3 or year 8, right? So I'm just going to wait until the Army tells me that. But what if in the meantime, you develop something better and cheaper or faster? Well, why can't you just submit on our open solicitation? Guess what? Yep, we lost. We know we lost. You told us why exactly we lost, but guess what? We fixed that. Now we're better. And that's not necessarily to say we're going to completely unseat that incumbent, but maybe they keep going and we have a little side competition. And if you can unseat them, then maybe they don't get their next option year. Or maybe now we have a multiple award. Those are all considerations we should have.
Tara, you were going to follow up?
I was, just because the silver bullet analogy sort of hits the exact point that I think we're at least trying to make, which is it is fantastic that OTAs have become more prevalent. I mean, they've been around for half a century, right? So it's just that they're in vogue right now. And that's a little bit because some companies have had great success with their hammer, and now every contract looks like a nail. And so the point is that there's so many different mechanisms to use. Definitely OTAs. Also, many different types of FAR contracts. And there is no silver bullet because we need silver and gold and platinum, and that's all the metals I know. But it should be all of it. And this is the kind, if you can get the workforce to a point where you're thinking creatively about the whole portfolio of options, rather than this is the kind of contract I always write, no matter what it's for, I'm going to keep writing the same thing. That's the goal.
All right. You only know 3 metals? That sounds expensive. Okay. I'd like to follow up with JD. Interesting business. When you look at his company, not a traditional defense prime, but delivering capabilities on top of what traditional defense primes have delivered, or integrating capabilities from multiple sources. So when we think about right to repair, I would also encourage you to think about what it looks like for the Army to retain the right to innovate. So if we give away the technical baseline, if we allow proprietary commercial solutions that for which the Army has little rights, I think we're going to rely on companies like companies like Parry Labs, to allow us to continue to innovate and deliver better and better capabilities. That is, I think, a strategic risk that we could box ourselves out. How do you view a lot of these Army processes for Parry? And what do you think? Which of these new initiatives do you think help a company like yours? And then how is that different from what you've seen in the past, JD?
Yeah, thanks. I'll get to your sort of opening remarks at the end, but to sort of talk specifically about really, a lot of these new policy directives, and thank goodness for the people on this panel, because I do not want to deal with all the legal, bureaucratic, and cultural changes that they have to drive to make all this happen. But I do think it's important that industry really takes these new contracting and procurement policies and really internalizes them into their business. One of the reasons I started my business is because I got frustrated that the right ideas didn't win. And what I love about the capability and needs is that it really drives a focus in government to really allow the right ideas to surface and to start that dialogue early, to not be constrained or boxed in. But I think on the other side of industry, the right ideas to win means a lot of conviction, and you have to invest real money. You have to put real resources aligned to that. And it takes a much greater all-in sort of mentality. From there, it's really about how do we go prove this out and validate it. And with the, expansion to TIC, I think companies want to all participate in TIC, but I don't think they're all fully prepared to understand what that means, which means your idea may not fully work, or we like parts of it, but we don't really want to buy it that way. You got to go work with someone else. I think that there's has to be a lot greater corporate commitment to understanding how you go to market through both that capability and needs to then into the TIC. And then finally, all the contracting opportunities, the CSOs, the OTAs, the FAR-based contracts, the non-FAR contracts, that commitment to scale. I think as you come through that process, I think, there's a paradigm shift for industry that has to be internalized, whether you're at a big company and you want to call yourself an entrepreneur, or you're at a small business as an entrepreneur. You have to have conviction on your ideas. You have to have, to truly solve real problems. You have to continue to iterate and pour money behind things. You have to find different ways to go to market and create adoption around these solutions. And then you have to be able to continually recompete. So I think the hyper leveraged OEMs that expect 20, 30, 40-year life cycles to capitalize on their investments, I think those days are done. And so I think that there's a lot of things that we're talking about here on contracting, but the business paradigms are huge. And I think while we all want the quick contracts or wins, I think we also have to be committed on the capital side to go all the way. To your first question, David, I think the other challenge that I see is we're looking at a lot of new programs and having new acquisition strategies for new programs. I would challenge the Army to really look at how we can drive innovation into existing systems. How can you apply software acquisition pathways, mid-tier acquisition pathways into legacy platforms? I think there's a lot of great programs in DoD's history where they've been able to realize a lot of cost, performance, and schedule impacts by taking non-traditional paths. I think of I always use this business parallel. There's a lot of companies in the aviation community that don't build aircraft, that do a lot with aircraft. I think of, L3 Greenville, who probably knows more about a Boeing 707 than Boeing does at this point, but they've been modifying for $5 billion a year these aircraft to be exquisite, ISR platforms for Big Safari and the Air Force. And I think, as we look today at the Army, where we're trying to create, a digital centric combat ecosystem, we're trying to take, big programs that we have like tanks and artillery and all these platforms, and we want to make them digitally connected. We're going to have to find new ways to acquire things inside of existing program offices. And there's great contract options now set forth, but there's got to be a lot of creativity all the way through the process.
So do you see that as maybe an important step that the Army has to take to break what could be perceived as a stranglehold on those major platforms so that companies other than the original OEM can modify or add capability in the future?
Certainly at the leadership level, the Army has money, the Army owns assets, and at the secretary level, they certainly own the ability to accept risk. And I think to navigate that, there's certainly levels of risk management that need to be applied. There's certain levels of planning that need to be applied, but you can do a lot with really smart people.
Yeah, I think you guys are kind of alluding to right to repair, or more broadly, right to modify, right to adapt, innovate. And you're right. There's a lot of legacy kind of investment that maybe didn't get negotiated that way, but by and large, those are with companies that still anticipate doing business with the Army going forward. And so I think our message is right to repair. Of course, it's something we're going to pay a lot of attention to going forward. We're also going to pay a lot of attention to it looking backward, right, for exactly the points that JD is raising.
What I was trying to sort of draw out a little bit is that the kinds of things that those companies did, and I think Parry has done this on a contract, it was in an area where the government didn't buy those rights, but instead they used reverse engineering and other things. And while I was in Detroit working combat systems, there was a strong dialogue amongst leaders. Some who believed that the only pathway to success was to hold the OEMs 100% accountable for fully installed system performance. And then other senior leaders who wanted the government to bear some risk and allow people outside of the original manufacturer to modify that platform. But then, of course, once you'd done that, you couldn't hold the OEM contractually accountable for performance. Where do you think we should fall on that spectrum?
A very case-by-case basis. I think there's some tremendous OEMs. I mean, if America goes to war tomorrow, there's, undoubtedly literally hundreds of millions of square footage of manufacturing space to create scale for our military industrial base at all large OEMs today. I think, on one hand, I've had OEMs where you can't even get an NDA done with them, where they say you pretty much can't even talk with them without being able to use any of your ideas for anything. And on the other side, we have great relationships with OEMs where we're partners on multiple programs and platforms or systems. So I think there's a paradigm. I think, for us, we work with government program offices directly, as well as with OEMs to help solve these problems.
There's a supplier management aspect of this problem, which is also really essential. I mean, one of the unique aspects of Govini is we work only with the US federal government. We have no private sector customers. And the reason is because there are many reasons. Among them is today the OEMs are not incentivized to proactively manage suppliers to the extent that I think the Department of Defense really needs them to. Until you have that incentive alignment, the market opportunity from our perspective is much less interesting. But through a national security lens, when we talk to these primes, and we've got the program office in the room who's now looking at illuminated challenges and breakdowns in the supply chain, the prime says to us privately, yeah, but solving it ahead of time doesn't do me any good. So why am I going to invest capital to identify that proactively? If DoD brings me the problem, I'll solve it then. So that's a big piece of it that I think is very timely.
Yeah, I think you're on to something that drives a lot of behaviors, and a lot of these companies all respond to the incentives that are laid out, both in the contract and then implicitly as well. And while they're in production, they have a huge incentive to get parts on the line, but they're also not particularly incentivized by buying those parts as cheaply as possible. And so it's balancing those things as opposed to a new entrant that might have a greater incentive to try to secure that work. So that it's an interesting balance for sure. We're kind of getting around the edges around right to repair, but also what data the government needs to buy to be able to execute that. How much could be done through reverse engineering. And it reminds me of some technology that I saw recently, which allowed for a part to be scanned or photographed, and then a model to be generated using AI, machine learning, to generate a model that would allow that part to sometimes be built through additive manufacturing or otherwise just generating a drawing. And so there's we're starting to see, I'll say, the power of AI to transform right to repair and sustainment. I know for you, Colonel Kaloostian, we got a lot of senior leaders talking about what artificial intelligence is going to do in Army Command and Control. As the Army invests in it, can you address how you think industry should be using and integrating these tools?
Thanks, sir. I can certainly add about how I think industry can be involved, right, to help us solve the problem. So I'm the oddball on this panel, right? I'm not an acquisition or a contracting professional, but I do lead a team that does really well of developing concepts, requirements, and then we lead through experimentation. And that's what we've been doing the last 2 years with Next Generation Command and Control, is experimenting with different companies to ensure we understand the complete tech stack. And if you don't understand Next Generation C2, it is a conflation of a complete tech stack of applications, transport, infrastructure, and data, right? We have to get that right. And to be honest with you, the biggest thing for us is the data layer. And that's where artificial intelligence and future capabilities like artificial intelligence come in. We have to understand the data and how we integrate data across a different platform. All of our forces need access to that same level of data. For artificial intelligence, for C2, decision dominance is the answer, right? Whoever's able to sift through the amount of data that's going to be available on the battlefield of tomorrow, to sort through that and use that information effectively to make decisions, that force is going to win war. There's no doubt about it. We have adversaries who are going after these capabilities just as fast and the same level of rigor and thought as we are. So they have, this becomes really what commander is more well-informed to make those better, faster, more decisions than their adversary. So that's the C2 dynamic of artificial intelligence. That's what we're trying to capture. So industry helps us figure out what that data plane looks like, how we're bringing data in, ingesting in, and then ingesting that data and then sorting through that data to make something, really relevant for our commanders. And we have to do it real time. Right. So what we're doing, what we're going to see is more and more sensors are going to proliferate the battlefield. We're going to have more and more sources of data, whether it's commercial or government, partner, industry, whatever it might be. We're going to have all of this data that's going to be relevant to decision making that we're going to have to bring in and sort through at scale and at speed to be able to make the right decisions. So how we do that, how we use capabilities like edge compute to do things at the edge, right, against, when we know we're going to be running really fast against a sophisticated enemy, how are we doing that? So we're thinking through conceptually, having the acquisition capabilities or contracting mechanisms in place to allow us to experiment and prototype is super important, because what we can't do and what's not feasible in the future is to think that we can get embedded with one technology for 10 years. It can't happen, right? Technology's moving too quickly. Just think about how much we've done in the last 3 to 5 years, how far, industry has come, or I'm sorry, technology has come in the last 3 to 5 years. It's going to continue at that pace of change, and we have to stay in front of it. So having flexible contracting mechanisms to allow us to experiment with companies is going to be really important. For Mr. Welch brought up the characteristics of need statement. We are using that as our foundational foundational document or requirements document, because we know it's going to be flexible, it's non-traditional, and we know it's flexible enough to continue to update after each key milestone event. PCC 5 was our last one. We just updated a brand new, General Rainey signed off on a new update for the characteristics of need statement that is available on sam.gov right now. So if you search through sam.gov, you'll have an opportunity to see it. And you'll see that decision dominance is new characteristic in our characteristics of need. It's that important. AI-enabled decision dominance is where we need to come, and where we, and what the future is. So I encourage you to look at the new characteristics of need, to understand that, but be subscribing to those things and understand from us through different, solution offerings, how you can submit unsolicited white papers, and so we can review your technology and figure out ways to bring you into experimentation and prototyping.
Thanks. What you described is a pretty complex system of systems, and typically we end up contracting for individual systems, and the legacy requirements process that we've all enjoyed was really driven by a desire to force the acquisition community to buy something sort of specific, right? The user knew what they thought they wanted, and they would try to, I've often described requirements like almost like a suitcase, right? Certain things fit in that suitcase, other things don't. And the requirements community would try to write a requirement that made the suitcase very form-fitting so that only one thing would fit. Like a case for a French horn almost, right? You can't put anything else in that case, only a French horn. Now you're talking about a capability need statement that's much broader, right? So how are you going to, I'll say that the tendency in the past was to make sure you didn't get anything in the case you didn't want. Are you going to be willing to accept the things in the case that you didn't think of?
100% going to be willing for that, right? So I think creativity is going to help us win, right? I said whoever is able to sort through and make sense of data more rapidly is going to be the force that wins in the future. Creativity is what's going to get us there. We have to think differently than what we have in the past. We have to think through command and control differently than what we have in the past. And certainly there are things that we're not going to think about through concepts and requirements that we need industry's help to help industry's assistance to help us see what that is. There's some things we just don't understand. And then through dialogue with our commanders and with our forces through warfighter touch points, we understand how do we apply that technology more effectively to ensure that we're actually making that impact and having that effect that we want to on the battlefield of tomorrow.
I think what Colonel Kaloostian is describing is really intellectual humility on our part as requirements writers, right? I think we have an idea. The Army has an idea about what it wants. But, just to get to the point that General Bassett brought up of this is exactly what it is, I mean, that really constrains a lot of solutions. My sense with working with industry over many years is there's an anticipation that the government will tell you exactly what we need. And it's a strange situation to be in where the government is saying, I'm not sure exactly, what it is that we're looking for. But that is actually the intent of these characteristic of needs, describing the problems, giving us a better sense of what could be leveraged to solve it. And then, we'll have to work through a trade-off process, I think, continually. I just want to add also, by the way, Mike, I mean, in terms of you not being part of the workforce, you did talk about sam.gov and unsolicited white papers. So I think you are an honorary member of the contracting acquisition
You have
workforce,
all taught me well.
whether you like it or not.
Yeah, it just so happens I have an Army Acquisition Corps pin that I'll give you later, but I didn't get it on contract. It's super interesting though that because it does require a change in culture on both sides, right? It is that operational humility that says, hey, we're not sure exactly what we want. Because in the past, we would set a requirement, and if it didn't do all of those things, we couldn't buy it. And we would set things as key performance parameters that really weren't. Sometimes the logisticians in the room, do we have any logisticians? everybody should raise their hands. We're all logisticians. No, they would say reliability is a KPP, right? And so you'd establish that as 6,000 hours between failure. And then we'd go test it, and it was 5,900 hours. You'd ask the user, and you say, do you still want it? They say, yeah, of course. It's way better than what we have today. But you just told us that we wouldn't buy it unless it was a specific number. And we tend to not understand the trade space, even around those KPPs. And now we're saying, let's open it up. Let's see what the capabilities are, what their limitations are, and then not necessarily have a lengthy test program that has to prove out every single performance specification in the contract. And so that sounds like that's, we all talk about doing acquisition different. And some of the loudest voices out there right now in acquisition reform are the ones with the least experience delivering capability. So I will say the entire program today was around people that have been working towards delivering capability, and having those experienced voices of trusted professionals, I think, is incredibly important, because otherwise they get drowned out by, I'll say, a chattering class of very loud voices that have never delivered a system to the Army in their whole life. You can decide who that might be. I think this takes us to our Q&A. I was going to make it to the end without being bitter.
I'm gonna say
Danielle?
one thing, yeah, before we go, because just to tie a couple things there together on a happy note. So I think back to what Colonel Kaloostian was saying, and I think which is super important right now, and I love this, and I want to say it because it provides me job security. What is super cool about what is happening right now is there is such an appetite to buy more than one of a capability, right? So there is such an appetite right now to try different versions of a solution and see how that works. And I think there's such an appetite to continue with different versions. I would say both myself and Mr. Welch have spent a very long time thinking through how to do that quickly. In general, I think a lot of times when we have went to buy things in my entire career, we pick one vendor, pick what you want to call them. Do you want to call them an integrator? Do you want to call them an OEM? Are they the same thing, but has a different word? That is how we went. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't still need that type of role. What their role is, how do you call that? And then what feeds up to them, and what our role in privity of contract with who all the other pieces are that you might need to play together on any given system or any given requirement. Because it's almost next to never a thing. And Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably have this data. It's probably never a thing that when we award a thing to somebody, it's just one company, right? For the most part, it's always multiple.
Yeah.
And so
dramatically true.
Right. It's always true, right? But for the most part, we only talk about the one quote unquote prime integrator OEM. I think there is a huge culture shift right now, not to say that role still isn't there, but to say the government has a role to redefine what that looks like, to give that type of role more of a outcome, and then also incentivize all the component or subcontractors, whatever the term of the day you want to use, to say, just like Colonel Kaloostian said, those people can also have solutions and submit separately, and we, the government, can work with the OEM, the integrator, whatever term prime you want to use to talk about that next cool solution.
So this is not something we've never done in the past, right? The MREP program was a great example where we awarded simultaneously to 5 vendors. We awarded, 60 vehicles apiece to 5 vendors, and the ones that performed the best got the follow-on delivering orders. And at the end, we didn't assume that the only person that could install a radio in an MRAP was, Navistar or Oshkosh or, any of the other vendors. We actually had the Navy's own SPAWAR do that integration. It's where the government retained the right to innovate, the right to, and the right to repair, even on those rapidly procured vehicles, because we didn't have to buy all that data to be able to order parts for it.
So think about it like you had a multiple award contract with those 5 primes, but what happens if you picked 3 and the one who had a brand name tires, you knew those tires are the ones that we needed, but you still want to keep 3 primes, OEMs, but those are really the tires you need. That's really kind of how we're thinking through things, which is very much down to the subcomponent levels.
Right. And I think the art is going to be to drive value down and into that supply chain
Yeah.
when you don't have contract privity necessarily, right?
Right.
Because I'll just say, I think sometimes the margins on things in the supply chain are significantly higher than prime vendors.
So we wrote and we posted this a few times when we talked about it at some industry events at ACC APG about the government having privity of contract. Understand that gives us risk, right? Because then how can I hold you potentially accountable? But back to what Colonel Kaloostian said, if you are part of it, if you did not win as part of a team today on a prime OEM integrator, whatever the term is you want to use, and you are a component provider of anything right now in the Army that you think is better, we have an open solicitation right now that you can say, because I would say, Mr. Welch, the whole Army open solicitation generated from a conversation between you and I about square tires versus round tires. So if today somebody can do square tires and we don't buy that today through that prime, submit on our Army open solicitation. We are willing to consider that.
And I'd point out that the Army network has always been so complex and so broad that we've I guess if you go all the way back to mobile subscriber equipment, we did contract with a single vendor, but those days are long past, right? So we're not in a business of holding a single vendor accountable for the performance of the Army network. There's just too many things that play a role in that. So I just got time for a couple of questions. If I don't read your question, it's because it wasn't as good as the ones that I do read. So I'll start with you, Joe. See, not just good looking. Once budgeting decisions are made, where can industry access this information? I think industry is struggling that the budget is moving so quickly, but P forms and R forms only come out annually, and they don't feel like they're getting in information. Is there any way to get real-time updates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we think gives us flexibility, which is the consolidation of many different lines that are in the P forms into something that we can kind of decide in the year that we have the money to do something slightly different or under a portfolio construct. That has the same effect of giving you uncertainty as to how we might spend that money, right? So our flexibility is your sort of mystery, and so I think that's good feedback. We need to find ways to communicate return on investment. I can tell you for what we've done on network is just kind of added all of the disparate ways that the Army is spending money right now and characterize the billions of dollars annually that the Army spends in command and control network related activity to kind of provide an assurance that there's a lot of money there. But in terms, I think you're going to see less of specific programs and how much is there, and you're going to have to find a way to navigate that a little bit. I do think, price reasonableness is something we're going to be taking a different kind of a look at. Traditionally, you see how much money we have, and that's what you form your solutions around. I do think, commercial, that's a great way to do valuation on what, a commercial pricing seems great. But there's other ways as well, opportunity cost. There are ways of calculating value to us. There's a good example right now, logistics elsewhere in DoD, where there's a company that's been working a deal with the government that if for a logistics sustainment operation, if some amount of money can be saved, then some portion of that goes back to that's how the payment goes back to the company that created that solution. I mean, talk about aligned incentives, right? And how to achieve price reasonableness. So I think there's a lot more to come on that topic, but I do acknowledge we need to do a different form of communication than our annual budgeting process if we want flexibility.
So Joe, I think for a lot of companies though, money in the budget is the demand signal, right? We can talk all about, we put something on sam.gov, but they're looking in the budget, they're looking in the FIDIP, and they're trying to say, here's how much money's going into a certain area. And yet, as the Army demands more flexible funding authorities, it's harder for industry to ascertain how much of that is really going to a certain priority. How do you do that?
Well, I think you have to continue conversations with us, right? Like we make ourselves available. We run lots of industry engagements, industry days, to this point of intellectual humility on what's available. If we have flexible funding, our priority to fund something might depend a lot on what is available and how much of a difference is it going to make for us, right? So I don't see any other way around that other than having a lot of more conversations about the capabilities that you have. But you won't be able to look at the line the program element potentially in the, in the president's budget to determine exactly where we're going to spend it. But you can convince us that it's worth spending money on, and you can give us a range of options. And I think the authorities that our leaders have that are executing through us, we're going to be able to move quickly on it. So hopefully that's encouraging.
Okay, we got a little bit less than a minute here. I'm gonna as just one lightning round question here. So the Army has stated in its plans that they're going to off ramp individual vendors on certain priorities. How do you think the Army is going to do this? And this is kind of to you, Colonel Kaloostian, or to you, Ms. Moyer, and especially when industry is already partnering together to deliver these capabilities. How do you see an off ramping happen for emerging technologies?
I'm just going to emphasize the need to do this. There's no way that we can progress forward with command and control solutions, a warfighting solution like Next Gen C2, without the ability to be able to on and off ramp companies quickly for experimentation and understanding where we're moving forward in requirements, right? So it has to happen. The only way we do this really to understand is to be able to bring in a company quickly, or off ramp based on performance, but to be able to assess through a prototype vehicle, to be able to assess at a division level, in the field while contested. That's when we really learn about software. That's when we really learn about the limitations or successes of hardware. So that's for us the need for it. And then of course I lean on Ms. Moyer and her team to help provide that vehicle.
Off ramp means do better.
All right. I'd like to wrap the panel up again by thanking all of our panel members for really, I think, clearly the best panel of the day, and for the team of trusted professionals that are so dedicated to delivering capability to our soldiers. Back to you, Les. Thanks for the opportunity today and a great forum here provided by AUSA.